Welcome to episode 97 of the Ski Podcast, and thanks for joining us. Today is a Down Under special, and we're going to be discussing skiing in Australia and New Zealand. Firstly, though, I'd like to thank Switzerland Tourism for supporting the Ski Podcast. We're going to have another feature on Switzerland in episode 98, where I'm going to be talking to someone who jumped to have a helicopter free-falling above the Jungfrau in Switzerland. So that should be pretty interesting. Now, my name's Ian Martin. I'd like to introduce my guest today. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Rachel Oaksash, founder of the snowsbest.com website. You were last on the show, Rachel, back in July 2020, a long time ago. How are you now?
I thought it was episode 56, wasn't it, Ian?
It was episode 56. Good memory.
I'm 10 COVID kilos heavier, but happier now all the borders are open.
Excellent. And Paul Anderson from NZSkis.com. You were last on the show just over a year ago. I looked it up. It was the 31st of May, episode 73. How are you going?
Kia ora. Yeah, very well. Thank you, Ian. Welcome to the Hermit Kingdom, as we affectionately refer to ourselves as during those 2 very difficult years.
Yeah, well, we'll be coming back to that and our conversation that we had a year ago. But let me start by asking my guests when and where you skied or snowboarded last. Rachel, we were just talking in the green room and you gave the game away a bit, but tell me where it was that you were last on snow.
Well, it was last year, actually. I haven't skied this season yet. So last year I was fortunate that during lockdown, I was in an LGA or a regional area of New South Wales, which allowed me to travel. And we had a fantastic snow season. And so I was able to drive down to Perisher and Thredbo and the New South Wales ski resorts and ski without a single lift line and ski, fresh tracks and behave as if the entire resort was your own. So I am actually skiing again in a couple of weeks and quietly dreading the ski de France, yeah.
Okay, well, it was a very strange season for everybody, although it's interesting. That does reflect perhaps a bit of what it was like in Europe in the season, if I can remember all of these things, 2020, 2021, when the lists were closed predominantly across Europe and locals had a fantastic time. They actually did lots of ski touring. They weren't able to catch a lift in most cases, but they did have the mountain to themselves. Paul, what about yourself? I know you're a very busy man. Have you been able to get out onto the mountain?
Yeah, for me at this time of the year, it's very early in the morning. So last time I skied was yesterday morning up at the Remarkables, and I was up here at about 6:30 and on my skis to walk up. So I walked up to the top of Shadow Basin and skied the fresh tracks down, and then just rolled my sleeves up and dived into the rentals department for the onslaught of Australians we've got in Queenstown at the moment.
A wonderful way to start the day by
amazing
soaring to the top. Had the sun come up already?
It was coming up as I was going up. I started off with a head torch, and kind of by the time I had my skins off and was skiing down, the sun was hitting the peaks. It's stunning. It's an amazing time. I say to people, it's my form of meditation.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I'm a big fan of ski touring as well. I've only done the sunrise ski touring once, which I did in Val Thorens a few years ago. It's very exciting to be on the slopes. I'm guessing probably some of the snow groomers were still around preparing the piece as well, kind of off the side, hopefully.
Yeah. No, they were finishing off. I went up Shadow because they had finished that basin early, so they were still up in our main basins finishing off, yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that's great to hear that you've been on snow. We're about the time of year at the moment where we're about as far away from skiing as you can get in terms of the winter season. We, into July now. It's on the way. There is summer skiing going on, and our last episode 96, we had a couple of reports from Team and laid us out. The snow conditions are not good over in Europe for summer skiing. It has been very warm, and unfortunately, Val d'Isère didn't open at all. Teen is closed down already. There's a glacier or a peak in Austria called Somblick. They normally experience their snow melting, but it's happened a month earlier than usual. And you may have heard about the Italian glacier in the Dolomites, which collapsed earlier this week, tragically leading to lives being lost. Let's be more positive, though, and talk about the snow in the southern hemisphere. Both Australia and New Zealand have started very well. I think there's been an El Niño effect, and certainly records have been set for early season skiing. I wondered, Rachel, if you could tell us a little bit more about the situation in Australia for early season.
Well, we've actually been in La Niña down here. So we've had across the Pacific higher precipitation. So, and with lower temperatures, obviously, that ends up falling as snow. We were fortunate in Australia on one level that we had a massive snowstorm of about 120 centimetres 2 weeks before the season started. It remained cold. The resorts were able to open a week early. There never comes a time where you actually think there is such a thing as too much snow. But if you're Selwyn Snowfields, which is a ski resort in Australia that unfortunately burnt down in the bushfires in 2020 and had rebuilt and was opening this season, they had too much snow and they weren't able to actually finish the final construction that they had to do before the season launch. So they won't open again until next year now.
So in that case, there literally was too much snow. And I do remember about that. The bushfires ripped through there, didn't it? And it meant that they had to rebuild. But some of the resorts, I think Hotham had their best snow for 30 years or something like that.
Yes, that's what they were all claiming. Best season since 2000, and 2000 was a record season that everybody talks about, and that's the barometer by which the resorts go, do you think we'll be as good as that season? But obviously since then, and then obviously Paul can tell you, New Zealand backed up and followed us with some phenomenal snowfall, and they're still going. And Australia does need a bit of a top up now, I have to be honest. But there's, maybe 20 centimetres coming this week. We probably need a bit more than that, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, well, 20 centimetres is perfect timing for your impending trip next week as well, then, isn't it? Paul, what about yourself? I also understand it's been a pretty good start for snow in the South Island as well.
Yeah, particularly in the south of the South Island. So the Queenstown and Wanaka region had an incredible start. A very unusual storm. We're in a La Nina system at the moment as well, and it was a very unusual storm which came straight up from the south and then took a very hard right turn and came into us as a nor'wester. And our nor'wester is usually windy and rainy, but this one was cold and very snowy. And Coronet Peak got 1.20 meters, kind of like our mates over the hill in Treble Cone did very well out of it. Remarkables across the basin got less, but still a good covering on their trails. Up north in Canterbury, Mount Hutt lucked out a wee bit. They got the snow, but they got a lot of wind and it blew the snow off their ridges. So they had a really unusual situation with 4-meter drifts around their base building and on their lower lifts and virtually nothing on the ridges and up the top. We've got a good storm coming in, though, from tonight, actually. From tonight, over the next couple of days, we should get somewhere between 20 and 40 centimetres on our 3 resorts.
So, overall then, the picture is good. You've got good coverage with more coming in, which is exactly what you need for the early part of the season, which it still is in both Australia and New Zealand, right?
Coronet Peak's our poster child, and when it's covered in snow, it looks incredible. It skis very, very wide, and it's doing so well up there at the moment.
And I've not seen the New Zealand resorts look as good as they look at this time of the year in years. It really is fantastic. And traditionally what happens is Australia has a good season, New Zealand doesn't. New Zealand has a good season, Australia doesn't. It kind of moves that way. And in the South Island, as Paul would tell you, that's so unusual that down the south would get so much more than up in Canterbury. And it's
completely
coming out of just people digging out the nutcracker rope toes from the club fields in Canterbury, which is it's really exciting, and it looks really chalky as well. It doesn't look wet at all. It looks all chalky and squeaky. And am I right or wrong, Paul?
No, you're right. It's it stayed really cold, and the advantage of Coronet Peak with that nice cold base, and we've had very cold nights, so getting some great snowmaking made on top. So lovely freshen ups every day. It's been great.
This could be actually a good opportunity. This could be a good opportunity, Paul, just to remind the listener who may not be aware. I mean, I'm sure they know the geography of New Zealand and the North Island and the South Island, but you work for NZSki.com, so you represent 3 different resorts, I think. Do you want to just explain roughly, where they are?
Yeah, correct. So we're in the South Island of New Zealand. We've got 2 resorts in the Queenstown region, which is more southern. That's Coronet Peak and Remarkables. And we've got Mount Hutt in Canterbury, which is about 500 k's north of where I am here towards the east coast of the South Island and just inland from Christchurch.
Yeah, and just, to complete the geography, there is obviously other skiing in the South Island as well. I think we've got Treble Cone and Cardrona, right?
Yeah, so our mates over the hill, Cardrona and TC closer to Wanaka. Cardrona's kind of between Queenstown and Wanaka. Then we've got all the club fields up in that Canterbury zone. There's a few fields between us and Canterbury, like Ohow and Dobson and Roundhill. And then in the North Island, in the middle of the North Island, we've got Whakapapa and Turua.
Yeah, and I think several people will have heard of those as well. That's excellent. Now let's come on to, so the snow is a brilliant start. In some ways, it's very interesting following the situation in Australia and New Zealand, because it's kind of mirroring what we've been through in Europe. When I spoke to you a year ago, Paul, we were really positive. You were looking forward to welcoming all the Australians over. The Trans-Tasman bubble, was in place there. And in fact, I listened to that interview and you saying how excited you were about it. And then we went into that, I think it was the Delta lockdown. It's so hard to remember how these things, which of these things it was. How did that 2021 season work out in the end for you, Paul?
It seems a lifetime ago. So much happened during that 2021 season. Yeah, as you said, we were really excited. We had open borders going into the season. And then I think it was halfway through the Australian school holidays, our border closed with that Delta outbreak. Yeah, you're correct. We reverted to a largely domestic visitation, which was awesome during the school holidays. But for us, the Australian market really increases our numbers outside of the school holidays just because of the sheer size of those population centres and the ease to get into Queenstown. Then later in the season, and I know this sounds like, of course it would happen like that, the old Murphy's Law, 18th of August, we had our next lockdown. So Omicron started to break in New Zealand, and our government took the very frustrating decision to put us into a 3-week lockdown. So we all sat at home and watched this incredible snow on Coronet Peak Remarkables. I can see both mountains from where I was working in the loft above my garage at home. It was excruciating. But, the most important thing we had to do during that period was look after our staff. We had 900 staff here in Queenstown, about 300 up in Methven, and we had to do everything to support them. And fortunately, with the help of the government, we could do that.
So how did the 2020 season end out in the end relative to normal seasons, if you can remember such a thing?
Yeah, so 2020 was a purely domestic season, so we had completely sealed borders. We were at least 40% down on visitation and 50% down on revenue, so pretty brutal from a business perspective. We had underestimated the amount of Kiwis who would actually come and ski because, of course, Kiwis couldn't go offshore either, so a lot of them chose to come down to Queenstown or to Canterbury and ski. So we were understaffed, and it was really tough on our staff. We tried to ramp up during the season. Then last year we corrected that. We had far more staff on board, but then we lost the Australian market, so it was kind of the opposite. So just brutal business conditions, but on the whole, my reflection on it is, as a business in the tourism industry, we haven't done too bad because we've got a solid local base. We're also a recreation business as well as a tourism business. And so we're so grateful to our local communities who have just come out and supported us.
That domestic market was so important, and that did keep, you may be aware that Switzerland was open, the only country to keep turning their lifts during that 2021 season. And in fact, many of the smaller resorts, the ones who didn't rely on international tourism, such as Verbier or Zermatt, etc., did better that season because they were, experiencing the same kind of effect that you're talking about there, where the domestic market were much more likely to stay in Switzerland than to go overseas. So for them, it worked out. Rachel, can I turn to you? How was the situation financially, let's say, for the Australian resorts? Because your experience was that domestically, people who lived locally were still able to go skiing, but obviously they couldn't welcome people in as they normally would.
No, well, in 2020, most of the resorts in Victoria closed completely for the entire season. I think Falls Creek and Hotham had 5 days each open. That was it, and Mount Buller probably a month. And then last year, they lost a lot of their metro metro visitation because both Sydney and Melbourne were in extensive long lockdowns and only regionals were allowed to travel. And then it became you were only allowed to exercise within your own LGA. So interesting for the New South Wales ski resorts is that the LGA of Cooma and Jindabyne is massive. So everybody could go and exercise and they could ski or they could backcountry ski, etc. But it's never enough to keep an entire ski resort as large as Perisher financially stable, I would imagine. I mean, I can't speak for Vale Resort.
But they kept running the lifts.
Yeah, they did up until a point. And yeah, they did up until a point, 100% they did. A lot of lodges and a lot of accommodations did shut down. Some chose not to even open for the entire season at the beginning anyway. So there was a lot of nervousness going into this season before Christmas. But once Australia opened the borders in December 15, stopped vaccine mandates at that point, etc. Once that all opened, and then April came along and we were completely open, people weren't concerned so much about whether the ski resorts would close down again.
I'm just interested in how strictly those borders were managed. If you lived in that area, did you have to prove that you lived in that area to buy a lift ticket? Or, could you have snuck across from one of the metropolitan areas?
Look, it depends how many Karens were in the actual LGA, really. As to whether you could get through or not. Look, I don't know. I think everybody experienced a certain level of restriction fatigue. If you lived in Victoria, it was a very different experience to that you lived in New South Wales, to what you lived in Queensland. That all came down to state government, because in Australia we have state governments, and they're the ones that make the decisions on whether borders open or close and whether you have to go into lockdown or not the federal. There was a lot of state rivalry over that. Some people are still in post-trauma stress from it. Some people are still following the restrictions from a year ago that are no longer there. And some people have just jumped on a plane and left.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends in WA where they were extremely restrictive in terms of who could go in and who could go out. And, my understanding is that there is, just across Australia in general, the same sort of thing that we've seen over here in the UK in particular, this pent up demand for people who weren't able to take their holidays, who are now not just taking one, but taking multiple holidays this year. Have you seen that in Australia?
Well, it depends on how much money you have. It depends on how privileged you were and how you came out of COVID. Some people came out of COVID way worse off than when they entered, and some people came out a lot richer. So it really depends on what your motivation level is and what your value system is to whether you've got the money to jump on a plane and go overseas. Fiji, as soon as the borders opened, and Fiji opened in December last year, they were booked solid of Australians for school holidays. Booked solid. You couldn't get a flight for love or money or accommodation over Christmas. But in terms of skiing and snowboarding, the resorts in Australia were fully booked before the season even started. You can't get accommodation in Australia skiing or snowboarding right now. You can through cancellations, but that's it. Because
right. Well, I mean, that does suggest that pent up demand is clearly coming out. So, Paul, how about yourself? Obviously, there's some key changes leading into the season. I think one of the most important was the end of testing in the Trans-Tasman bubble, or coming into New Zealand anyway. Has that led to an increase in bookings?
Yeah, I think so. There's so many dynamics going on in the market. It's hard to pin things on any one thing, but what I can tell you is that to try and get a flight across the Tasman at the moment is almost impossible. My brother was bringing my niece over to Queenstown, couldn't fly to Queenstown, couldn't find a way in. He had to go to he went to Christchurch, and we went up and skied at Mount Hutt instead.
I'm of the understanding that that's actually a capacity issue as to how many planes are actually flying and how many airlines have actually pulled out of flying that direct route as well.
Yeah, partly it's I think Virgin's not back on the route yet, so we've got Air New Zealand, Qantas, and Jetstar. And I actually met with Greg Foran from Air New Zealand and looking for a bit of an assurance that they were flooding that route with capacity. He told me they had 104% of the capacity that they had pre-COVID. But, of course, that 20% that we're missing from Virgin is affecting the availability of bookings. But I think on the other side of it, the Australians are absolutely booking up a storm. What we're seeing on the ground here is we're selling out every day at the moment. This week has just been mental. We've sold out of rentals. We're reaching out to all the rental shops in Queenstown to help us out to fulfil our customer bookings.
That is great. And just to clarify for listeners, that international market from Australia is key for New Zealand. I think I read somewhere the tourism minister saying that 71% of international tourists who are skiing in New Zealand are Australians.
Yeah, that's right. It is a critical market for us, and we did miss our Australian friends when they weren't here. The other thing about New Zealanders, we might say have got gorse in their pockets. The Australians spend up a storm. So to give you an idea, in the last week since the Australians arrived, our food and beverage yield increased by 40%.
Right. How much of that was beer?
Yeah, quite a wee bit, I'd say.
I mean, that is really, really good news to hear.
And
you mentioned about the limitations with airlines, and over here in Europe, we've got all sorts of problems with flights being cancelled, and that really comes down to staff shortages. And I have read that there are still limitations, in New Zealand in particular as well, in terms of staff. Maybe, I don't know if it affects you on the mountain, but certainly for hotels, etc. Have you found recruitment an issue for this winter?
Yeah, a really interesting one. I need to have a chat with my HR manager, because going into the winter, I kept on saying, "Are we okay? Are we okay?" And he's a very calm and collected gentleman, and he said to me, he was going, "Yeah, I think we are." And we actually changed our recruitment a wee bit, because we knew we were going to face an increased level of staff absences due to COVID, and we still have 7-day isolation, both for the person affected by COVID and their housemates. So that's pretty serious for us. We actually staffed to a 4-day roster rather than a 5-day roster to give us the flexibility to increase people's rosters if they wanted to. But what we're seeing is in some of the key departments, where they're skilled and you can't quickly train someone, that's where the pressure's really going on. Touch wood, this first 2-3 weeks, Omicron can do its thing, and we can get our staff back on board and enjoying it up here.
Is that mainly ski instructors, Paul? Because I found here that I've had a lot of people contact me to say that ski school is full, they can't get into any ski lessons, even the private lessons are full. This is obviously during school holidays. And yeah. I mean, that's obviously as a result of staff shortages because of, as you just mentioned, the training level.
It's right across the board for the staff absences, but we are sold out in snow sports. It's incredible. We're doing 3 times the snow sports business we did at the same time last year.
That is really good news. I did read as well that I think it was last week there was an announcement between New Zealand and the UK with a deal on working visas to make it easier for people to go between the 2 countries. So if there's some, are you still recruiting? Are there any? If there are any British instructors, could they be hooting their way to New Zealand?
Absolutely. Anyone who wants to work on a ski resort, would take them at the moment. We actually ran a kind of a beginning of the season, a recruitment fair in Queenstown last night, just because of some of those absences that have happened. We're needing to replace staff and increase our numbers. So I think we picked up about another 25 workers who will train up.
Great. Well, that's really good to hear. And it's really good to hear all of this positivity about the season down under. And I really hope that continues with both the snow and the bookings. I'm just going to change the topic slightly here and come back to you, Rachel. I was reading your excellent website, snowsbest.com, and a really interesting article on there recently about gender representation in snow sports. Now, regular listeners to the show will probably be aware that in the last couple of years, there's always been at least one female voice on the podcast, and that's something I've worked today really hard to try and ensure. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that post that you wrote about that.
Well, I think that's the key. What you're talking about, full stop, is being aware of it and actively making decisions around it to change it, as opposed to just assuming the change is just going to happen because, hey, isn't it 2022? That particular in-depth long feature article came about as a result of Cardrona and Treble Cone doing a self-audit of their social media and having a look and realising in 2020 that I think there was about, I wrote it down, they had 29% of their social media featured a female in their social media throughout that season. Yet, of that 29%, only 15% actually featured them actively skiing or snowboarding. And so they then thought, well, we're going to have to change this. So in 2021, they did 50-50. And then in 2022, for their first 2 full campaigns pre-season, they only featured women. And they sat back and waited to see if anybody noticed whether they only featured women. And then they did this big launch about how they only featured women. Then they did a short documentary called All In, which was really fascinating and talked to all of these female athletes about how they felt about being a woman in snow sports and the representation of women in snow sports in particular. And so then I just delved a little deeper. We did a story a number of years ago about the Australian ski fields, and it literally was, "Dear Australian ski fields, do you even know women can ski?" Because it was the opening. I didn't win a lot of friends, I have to tell you. 50% I didn't win, 50% I did. But it was because I had looked at all the social media that they had sent me, all of the, the VNR, the newsreels, the social media images, everything they sent. And 95% of them were males. There wasn't any representation of me as a female, let alone me as a middle-aged woman, let alone diversity of skin color or race. There was none of that, and certainly not women. So we wrote a story about that. So this particular story, I started to think it can't honestly and truly still be the case. Started looking at the ski media in Australia. If you looked at the 2 magazines, of which there's only 2 print magazines left here, of all of the 44 contributors, there was only 4 females. So it kind of starts at the top. It's, all run by all of these men. It's only male voices and male perspective that you're hearing. Not that male perspective is wrong. The guy that actually created the documentary for All In said that he thought he didn't realize how much he was part of the problem, because he would film the skiers for the social media channels and he'd go running out the door and he'd just grab his mates. And of course he's going to have more male mates and he'd throw them in front of the camera. And then he would take a woman and he would judge how they skied. And because they didn't ski as cool as he thought they should, which was the way his lens was to see males, he'd be like, "Oh no, I'm not putting that in." But at least he, through this experience, he became really aware of this bias he had. And then somebody sent me an email the other day saying, "Oh, did you see this person skiing? They were a female. That was great, but they skied really badly." And I said, "But what does it matter how someone skis? We just want to see everyone having fun. And we want to see ourselves. And we're not all Ted Lickety and Lindsay Vonn, let me tell you." So really, it's about showing the reality.
Is this therefore a campaign? Are you kind of lobbying resorts, or are you just bringing it to the fore?
Well, we lobbied a few years ago. I mean, Cardrona and Treble kind of lobbying. I believe that Mount Buller agreed to doing a self-audit. Whether they have or not, I don't know. I believe that Panorama in Canada agreed to doing a self-audit and making some changes. We created a hashtag called Show Us to Girls. And we created that hashtag and a Facebook group around that. We have 6,000 women in it. We started a number of years ago because you can't be what you can't see. So with social media, everyone's got a phone. Everyone can be a cameraman. Everyone can be a videographer. Throw yourself in front of a camera. Put yourself up on social media. Let's see more women skiing. Let's see more girls skiing. Let's see, and not all girls together. Let's see a mix.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that's very, very interesting. Paul, I have to ask you, do you have a gender representation policy at nzski.com?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a diversity policy, and I've got to say hats off to our friends in Monaco for challenging the industry to look at itself and how it is representing different groups, not just women, but different ethnicities and so on. I actually love the quote from Anna Smoothie in that All In film where she says, "In the end, we won't talk about girl skiers and boy skiers, men and women. Everyone will just be a skier. And we'll only know we're there when that happens." So, we do need to look at ourselves and go, hey, there might be some roles that we're not getting many women applicants. Why is that? Can we can we represent them in a different way? Can we, how can we change it? So yeah, just constantly challenging it. Absolutely, it's a great piece of work.
Cool. I can see that changes can happen. For example, in the UK, the Women's European Championships football, or soccer maybe to you guys, started yesterday. And this is a very high-profile event now. It's getting a lot of attention. In cricket, for example, maybe the designation that you're talking about there, Rachel, where people that used to be referred to batsmen are now batters. And that's become a very common term. And women's cricket also has a high profile in the UK. So I think, it's a period of, it can take a period of time, but I'll certainly put all the links into the All In documentary.
I mean, there's still a way to go, even with the FIFA and the cricket, because 8% of sponsorship dollars goes to women's sport, which means that 92% goes the opposite direction.
Well, I guess it's not something that's going to be changed immediately. In my experience of watching sport, and for example, my children, how they relate to it, is that things are definitely changing for sure. I mean, a few years back, my kids would never have known any of the names of any of the players in the women's football or cricket team, and now they know lots of them. So that has got to be a positive thing, I would say.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Right, we're going to move to the close now then. Just to let you know, listeners, that our survey is now closed. I want to thank everyone who responded. The winners of the Atomic Goggles were Chris Waters and Nicole Clarke, who it turns out I picked a winner at random who lives in Australia. I don't know if you've ever heard of Nicole Clarke. Anyway, we're going to send that out to her. Still looking through all the data. I'm going to summarise it on the website. Lots of feedback. I did note this comment from someone. It was anonymous, who said, I think reading out reviews at the end of the podcast comes across as a bit off. Reading out gushing reviews feels a bit over the top for me. Well, with that in mind, they do also say the podcast is approachable and friendly, and Gethin said on Facebook the podcast is great. Bit of feedback on our last episode, 96. We had Neil English on. His father founded the London ski show, and a couple of people posted. Caroline Eydallin said she worked on the first shows for Sauze. Sir David always used to stop by to say hello. It was really nice he remembered me. And Anne Bennett said Sir David English was a great guy, pioneered skiing in mass media. I worked on the first shows at the Inghams stand. In relation to the podcast, quick note on length. We're going to experiment with the length of the podcast. This one's going to be a bit shorter. I think in a time-compressed world, an hour may be a bit too much, although there were plenty of people who responded who said they'd be happy for the episodes to be like 90 minutes or more. A quick reply as well, a comment we had on the Arnie Wilson podcast, asked why, or they actually said that their podcast was too short. We didn't have enough time to include the tragic end to his Ski of the Year experience, which some listeners may know about. I have to say that this wasn't a time constraint. It was simply that Arnie did not want to discuss that. So I just wanted to clarify that. Now, I do enjoy all feedback about the show, so please do get in contact. Reviews, comments, wherever you want to leave them are always welcome. You can follow me at Skipedia and the podcast at the Ski Podcast. But for now, I'd like to thank Switzerland Tourism for sponsoring the show and thank my guest today, joining us from Australia, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
And joining us from New Zealand, Paul.
Kia ora, ngā mihi.
Excellent. And finally, listener, thank you for joining us today. And until next time, goodbye. Hi there, listener. This is Ian. Just a reminder that if you enjoy the podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/the ski podcast. While I'm eternally grateful to Switzerland Tourism for supporting the podcast, it doesn't go anywhere near covering the amount of time that it takes going into this. And just to give you an idea, here are the closing credits from another podcast that I really love, 99% Invisible.
99% Invisible was produced this week by Avery Truffman. It was edited by Delaney Hall. Fact-checking by Sona Avakian. Mix and tech production by Martin Gonzalez. Production assistance by Jacob Maldonado Medina and Sarah Bake. Music by our director of sound, Swan Real. Special thanks to Allison C. Meyer and Rebecca Lewin McCarley, who were so helpful with research for this story. Also thanks to Meredith Hottenot, Drew Haupt, Joy Uson, and most of all, to Zach Fishman. 99% Invisible's executive producer.
Yeah, well, you get the idea. There's a lot of people who go into producing a tremendous podcast that is 99% Invisible. I do my very best here, but if you enjoy it, please feel free to buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/the ski podcast. Thank you very much for listening.